Number 1. James Dean. September 30th, 1955. It was a Friday in California, the kind of day that feels endless, bathed in that golden, deceptive light of early autumn. The man behind the wheel was only 24 years old, yet he was already the face of a generation. James Dean, the rebel without a cause. He was the brooding, cigarette-smoking embodiment of American youth, a figure who seemed too cool, too intense, and perhaps too fragile for this world. He wasn't just an actor, he was a shifting tectonic plate in Hollywood. With only 3 major films to his name, 2 of which hadn't even been released yet, he had the world at his feet. But James Dean didn't care about the red carpets or the studio executives. He cared about speed. He cared about the visceral, raw adrenaline of the racetrack. He was driving his brand-new Porsche 550 Spider, a silver bullet of a machine he had affectionately and perhaps ominously nicknamed Little Bastard. It was a car built for one purpose: to go fast, to win. It was low to the ground, lightweight, and dangerous in the hands of the inexperienced. But Dean didn't see himself as inexperienced. He saw himself as invincible. That morning he had dressed for the occasion in a white t-shirt and red windbreaker, looking every bit the movie star, even though he was just a young man heading to a race in Salinas. There is a haunting anecdote that surrounds this car. Just a week prior, Alec Guinness had seen the Porsche. He told Dean that the car looked sinister. He reportedly said, "If you get in that car, you will be found dead in it by this time next week." Dean had just laughed. It was the laugh of a man who believed that death was something that happened to other people, not to the boy from Indiana who had conquered the silver screen. As we unravel these tragic moments where Hollywood legends met their sudden ends, if you want to stay with us through these dark corridors of history, take a moment now to subscribe, because the stories only get more harrowing from here. Dean revved the engine, the sound echoing off the garage walls, signaling the beginning of a drive that would never truly end. The journey north on Route 99 and then onto Route 466 was supposed to be a warm-up. Sitting next to Dean was Rolf Witherich, a Porsche factory mechanic who was there to break in the engine before the race. The plan was originally to tow the Spider on a trailer, but at the last minute, they decided Dean needed more time behind the wheel to get a feel for the machine. It was a fateful decision. As they tore through the California landscape, the air rushing over the open cockpit, Dean felt alive. The car was performing beautifully. It was an extension of his own restless spirit. At around 3:30 p.m., the reality of the law caught up with them, briefly. A California Highway Patrol officer pulled Dean over just south of Bakersfield. He was clocked doing 65 in a 55 zone. He signed the ticket, likely with that signature smirk, perhaps annoyed but undeterred. It was a mundane interaction, a small bureaucratic pause in a day destined for tragedy. The officer warned him to slow down. Dean nodded, pulled back onto the road, and the speedometer began to climb once again. By late afternoon, the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the asphalt. This is that dangerous time of day for drivers, often called the magic hour by cinematographers, but known as a blind spot by safety experts. The glare can be blinding. The silver paint of the Porsche 550 Spider acted almost like a mirror, camouflaging it against the gray road and the bright horizon. Dean was approaching the intersection of Route 466 and Route 41 near Chalame. It was a Y intersection, notorious among locals, but just another stretch of road to Dean. He was confident. He was in control. But control is an illusion when you are moving at high velocity in a tin can. As the intersection drew closer, Dean spotted a 1950 Ford Tudor coupe heading toward them from the opposite direction. The Ford began to turn left, cutting directly across Dean's path. "That guy's gotta stop. He'll see us," Dean reportedly said to Witherich. Those were his final words. A desperate assumption that the laws of the road would protect him. But the driver of the Ford, a 23-year-old student named Donald Turnipseed, didn't see the low-profile silver sports car blending into the twilight. He kept turning. Dean slammed on the brakes, but physics is unforgiving. The Porsche didn't just hit the Ford, it was obliterated by it. The massive, heavy steel of the American sedan collided with the lightweight German racer with a violence that echoed through the valley. The Spider cartwheeled into a ditch, a crumpled mass of aluminum and anguish. The silence that followed the crash was deafening. Weithrick, the mechanic, had been thrown from the car, surviving with serious injuries. But James Dean was pinned inside the wreckage. The impact was catastrophic. His neck had snapped instantly upon collision, coupled with massive internal injuries. When emergency responders arrived, there was no saving the rebel. He had been killed instantly, his life extinguished before the dust even settled. He was dead on arrival at the Paso Robles War Memorial Hospital. The world stopped. The youth of America wept. He became immortal not because of how he lived, but because he never had the chance to grow old. He remains forever 24, forever cool, forever driving into that setting sun. But history has a cruel way of repeating itself. Decades later, the winding roads of California would claim another blue-eyed icon, a man who built his entire career on the culture of speed and street racing, only to meet a fiery fate in a high-performance Porsche that proved just as merciless. Number 2. Paul Walker. Almost 60 years after James Dean's Silver Spider crumpled on a twilight highway, the ghosts of speed returned to California, this time to the sun-drenched streets of Santa Clarita. It was November 30th, 2013, the Saturday following Thanksgiving. The air was crisp, the sky a piercing blue, and the mood was one of generosity and community. Paul Walker, the 40-year-old star of the Fast and Furious franchise, was attending a charity event for his organization, Reach Out Worldwide, to help victims of Typhoon Haiyan. Paul was the man every guy wanted to be and every woman wanted to be with. Piercing blue eyes, a laid-back surfer demeanor, and a heart that seemed too big for the cutthroat world of Hollywood. He wasn't just an action star. He was a father, a philanthropist, and a genuine car enthusiast. But the machine sitting in the parking lot that afternoon was not a movie prop. It was a 2005 Porsche Carrera GT, painted a stark, bright red. In the automotive world, this car is legendary, not just for its engineering, but for its ferocity. It has a V10 engine derived from Formula One racing, no stability control, and a reputation for being unforgiving to even professional drivers. It was owned by Paul's close friend and financial advisor, Roger Rodas, an experienced racer himself. As the charity event wound down, Paul and Roger decided to take the car for a quick spin, just a short loop, a joyride to hear that V10 engine scream. "Let's go for a drive," Paul had said. It was innocent. It was the kind of thing car lovers do 1,000 times without consequence. As he slid into the passenger seat, he flashed that famous smile, the one that had graced billboards around the globe. He didn't know that he was strapping himself into a vehicle that Jay Leno once spun out of control, a car that required absolute precision every single second. As they pulled out of the driveway, leaving the safety of the event behind, the clock began to tick down on one of the most ironic and heartbreaking tragedies in modern pop culture history. They turned onto Hercules Street, a wide industrial road with a 45-mile-per-hour speed limit. It was a quiet weekend in the business park, practically deserted, tempting the driver to open up the throttle. And Roger did. The Porsche Carrera GT roared to life, its engine note a high-pitched wail that echoed off the concrete warehouses. Eyewitnesses would later describe seeing the red blur, estimating the speed at well over 100 miles per hour. For a few exhilarating seconds, they were flying. But physics, as we have seen, is a dispassionate judge. At that velocity, tires that were later found to be 9 years old and hardened by age lost their grip on the asphalt. The car began to drift. It wasn't a movie drift, controlled and choreographed. It was the chaotic, terrifying slide of lost control. The Porsche careened off the road. It smashed into a concrete lamppost and a tree with such devastating force that the car was almost sliced in half. The impact was so violent it tore the vehicle apart, scattering debris across the manicured landscaping. But the horror was only just beginning. Almost instantly, the fuel tank ruptured. Within seconds, the wreckage was engulfed in a fireball. The friends and employees at the charity event nearby heard the crash, a sickening thud followed by an explosion. They grabbed fire extinguishers and ran toward the plume of black smoke, desperate to save the man they loved. They risked their own lives trying to fight back the flames that were leaping feet into the air, scorching the tree above. But the heat was too intense. The inferno was absolute. They were forced back, helpless, watching the red car turn into a blackened tomb. When the fire was finally extinguished and the smoke cleared, the reality was grim. The autopsy reports were difficult to read, even for seasoned professionals. Paul Walker had died instantly. The report confirmed that the impact caused traumatic injuries that would have been fatal on their own, multiple fractures and internal trauma, but it was the combination of the impact and the thermal injuries that sealed his fate. He was trapped in a defensive posture, a heartbreaking final image of a man instinctively trying to protect himself in a situation where no protection was possible. The irony was suffocating. The man who had built a global empire on the fantasy of street racing, who had survived impossible stunts on the silver screen, had been killed in a senseless, high-speed crash on a quiet suburban street, riding as a passenger. The Fast and Furious family was broken. His daughter, Meadow, was left without a father. The crash sparked a massive conversation about high-performance tires and the safety of supercars, but for Paul, it was simply the end. A bright light extinguished in a mess of carbon fiber and steel. We leave the modern era of high-tech composites and move back in time to an era where cars were heavy, chrome-laden beasts and safety features were virtually non-existent. We travel to the sweltering heat of the American South in the late 1960s. Our next victim was the ultimate blonde bombshell, a woman whose curves defined a decade, but whose shocking death on a dark Louisiana highway was so gruesome, so physically devastating, that it forced the federal government to redesign every semi-truck on the road to ensure that kind of horror could never happen again. Number 3. Jayne Mansfield. The year was 1967. The summer of love was kicking off in San Francisco, but deep in the humid swamplands of Louisiana, the atmosphere was thick, heavy, and oppressive. It was the early hours of June 29, long past midnight, on a stretch of Highway 90 leading toward New Orleans. The woman sitting in the front passenger seat was one of the most photographed faces on the planet, Jayne Mansfield. She was the working man's Marilyn Monroe, a woman who had weaponized her platinum blonde hair and hourglass figure to become a global sex symbol. But behind the breathy voice and the public persona was a woman with a reported IQ of 163, a mother of 5, and a relentless entertainer who was hustling from one gig to the next. She was traveling in a 1966 Buick Electra 225, a massive slab of American iron known for its comfort and size. Driving the car was Ronnie Harrison, a 20-year-old employee of the nightclub where Jayne had just performed. Sitting between them was her lawyer and lover, Sam Brody. But the most precious cargo was asleep in the back seat. 3 of her children, Miklos, Zoltan, and a 3-year-old girl named Mariska, who would grow up to become the famous actress Mariska Hargitay. They were exhausted, speeding through the darkness to get to a television appearance the next morning. The road was narrow and dark, cutting through the bayou where the water meets the land. To combat the relentless swarms of insects that plagued the South in the summer, a mosquito fogging truck was driving ahead of them. This truck was moving slowly, pumping out a thick white chemical cloud designed to kill bugs. But in the dead of night, that cloud didn't just kill mosquitoes, it killed visibility. It created a dense, artificial fog bank that lingered on the asphalt, masking the rear of the truck completely.
The Buick was closing in fast, cruising at highway speeds, its headlights cutting through the gloom until they hit that wall of white smoke. Ronnie Harrison didn't see the truck. He didn't see the brake lights. He didn't see the danger until they were already inside the cloud.
In a split second, the world ended. This was not a sideswipe or a rollover. This was an underride collision, the specific type of crash that terrifyingly illustrates the incompatibility between passenger cars and commercial semi-trucks. The Buick didn't just hit the back of the trailer, it kept going. The nose of the car slid beneath the rear of the truck. Because the truck's bed was high and the Buick was low, the heavy steel of the trailer acted like a guillotine. The impact sheared off the entire roof of the car, peeling the metal back as if it were a sardine can. The violence of the crash is difficult to comprehend. The car was crushed all the way to the front seat headrests. For the three adults in the front, Ronnie, Sam, and Jayne, death was instantaneous. The physics allowed for no survival. The force of the collision was so severe that it sparked one of Hollywood's most gruesome and persistent urban legends, that Jayne Mansfield was decapitated. This wasn't technically true. Her death certificate lists a crushed skull and avulsion of the cranium, but the scene was so horrific, with her blonde wig thrown from the wreckage, that the legend took hold and never let go. Miraculously, amid the twisted metal and shattered glass, the wails of children pierced the silence. Because they were small and sleeping lying down in the back seat, the three children were spared the fatal impact that took the roof off the front section. They woke up in a nightmare, trapped in the wreckage of a car that had been destroyed around them, waiting for help on a lonely, dark highway, while the fog of the mosquito truck slowly drifted away into the bayou night. It was a scene of absolute devastation, a stark contrast between the innocence of the survivors and the brutality of the loss. The death of Jayne Mansfield did more than just fill the tabloids. It changed the very architecture of the American road. The photos of the Buick tucked completely under the truck horrified safety regulators. They realized that if the truck had a lower bumper, the car would have bounced off rather than sliding underneath. This realization led to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration mandating a steel bar be welded to the rear of all semi-trailers. Truckers call it the DOT bumper or the ICC bar, but to everyone who knows the history, they are called Mansfield bars. Every time you drive behind a truck today and see that metal loop hanging down, you are looking at Jayne Mansfield's legacy, a safety measure written in blood that has saved thousands of lives since that muggy night in 1967. While Jayne's death was a high-velocity tragedy on a public highway, our next case proves that you don't need speed, bad weather, or other drivers to meet a sudden end. Sometimes the threat is silent and sitting right in your own driveway. We move from the swamps of Louisiana to the hills of Studio City, nearly 50 years later. Our next victim was a brilliant young actor, a rising star in the Star Trek reboot, whose life was taken not by a high-speed collision, but by a freak design flaw in his own vehicle. He stepped out to check his mail, thinking his car was in park, but the machine behind him had not actually engaged the gear, setting the stage for a suffocating tragedy just feet from his front door.
Number 4. Anton Yelchin. It is a terrifying thought that the safest place in the world, your own home, can suddenly become the setting for your final moments. On the night of June 19, 2016, the hills of Studio City, Los Angeles were quiet. The frenetic energy of Hollywood feels miles away up there, hidden behind tall hedges and security gates. Living in this secluded enclave was Anton Yelchin. At just 27 years old, Anton was a rare breed in the entertainment industry. He was the young Chekhov in the rebooted Star Trek universe, a role that brought him global fame, yet he was known by his friends not as a movie star, but as a sensitive, artistic soul. He was a photographer, a musician, and an actor with a depth that far exceeded his years. He had his whole life ahead of him, a career that was just beginning to blossom into something profound. That Sunday night, Anton was supposed to meet friends for a rehearsal. He was heading out, stepping into his 2015 Jeep Grand Cherokee. It was a large, heavy, safe-looking SUV, a vehicle designed to protect its occupants from the dangers of the road. But the danger that night wasn't on the freeway. It was right there in the driveway. Anton's driveway was steep, a sharp incline leading down to a heavy steel security gate that separated his property from the street. At around 1:10 a.m., for reasons we will never fully know, Anton stopped the Jeep halfway down the driveway. Perhaps he had forgotten to check the mailbox at the gate. Maybe he needed to clear some debris. He brought the 2.5-ton vehicle to a halt. He shifted the gear lever, opened the door, and stepped out into the cool night air. He walked behind the vehicle toward the gate. He had no idea that he had just made a fatal mistake, one that wasn't entirely his fault, but rather the result of a confusing design choice that would soon become the subject of a massive global recall. The engine was still purring, the headlights were cutting through the darkness, and then gravity took hold.
To understand this tragedy, you have to understand the machine. The 2015 Jeep Grand Cherokee was equipped with a monostable electronic gear shifter. Unlike a traditional stick that physically clicks into place, this shifter worked more like a joystick. You pushed it forward or backward to change gears, and then it would spring back to the center position. There was no tactile thud to tell you that you were definitely in park. You had to rely on a small light on the console. It was a sleek, modern design, but it was also deceptively dangerous. Drivers often thought they had put the car in park when, in reality, it was sitting in neutral. That is exactly what happened to Anton Yelchin. He believed the beast was asleep, but it was merely waiting. As he stood behind the Jeep, checking the gate, the vehicle began to roll backward. A car in neutral on a steep incline moves silently. There's no revving engine, no screech of tires, just the hush of rubber rolling over pavement. It gained momentum instantly. Anton was standing directly in its path, with the unyielding steel bars of the security gate behind him. He was trapped in a kill zone. In a split second, the heavy SUV slammed into him. It didn't run him over, it pinned him. The rear bumper pressed him against the brick pillar and the metal gate with crushing force. The weight of the Jeep was immense. This wasn't a quick impact like a highway crash, it was a vice. The pressure on his chest was catastrophic. The medical term is traumatic asphyxia. It means the weight was so great that his lungs could not expand to take in air. His ribs were compressed, and despite his strength, there was no pushing back 2 tons of steel. He was pinned there, alone in the dark, just feet from the safety of his front door, while the Jeep's engine continued to idle, indifferent to the life it was extinguishing. The discovery of the scene was as heartbreaking as the accident itself. When Anton didn't show up for the rehearsal, his friends grew worried. They drove to his house around 1 a.m., expecting perhaps a flat tire or a dead battery. Instead, they found a nightmare. The Jeep was still running. The radio was likely still playing. The interior lights were on. And pinned between the bumper and the gate was Anton. He had been dead for less than a minute when the incident occurred, but by the time he was found, the silence was absolute. The coroner ruled the death accidental, caused by blunt traumatic asphyxia. He lost consciousness rapidly, likely within seconds, due to the intense pressure, but the thought of those final moments is terrifyingly claustrophobic. His death triggered a class-action lawsuit and a recall of over 1 million vehicles to fix the confusing shifter design, but no recall could bring back the bright young talent who joined the infamous 27 Club in the most mundane and tragic way possible. It wasn't drugs, and it wasn't a fast life. It was a parking gear. Anton's death was a freak accident, a slow-motion tragedy where the vehicle acted as a crushing weight. But for our next case, we return to the high-octane world of adrenaline junkies, where speed is a religion. We move to Pennsylvania, to a man who made millions laughing at pain and mocking death as a star of the Jackass franchise. He spent his life performing dangerous stunts for the camera, surviving bowls, falls, and explosions. But his final act was unscripted.
He took a high-performance Porsche 911 GT3 out for a late-night run, pushing the speedometer to triple digits until the road ran out and the night erupted into flames. Number 5. Ryan Dunn. If you watched television in the early 2000s, you knew the face of chaos. It was bearded, often smiling, and usually about to do something incredibly painful for the amusement of millions. Ryan Dunn was a central pillar of the Jackass crew, a group of friends who turned self-inflicted stunts and pranks into a global phenomenon. Ryan was the everyman of the group, lovable, rugged, and seemingly indestructible. He had thrown himself into shopping carts, dived into sewage, and crashed golf carts, always emerging with a laugh and a bruise. He had built a life on the edge, convincing the world, and perhaps himself, that he was made of rubber. But the line between a calculated stunt and a real-world catastrophe is razor thin, and on the night of June 20th, 2011, that line was crossed with devastating finality. It was a humid Monday morning in West Goshen Township, Pennsylvania, long before the sun had risen. Ryan had spent the evening at a local bar, Barnaby's, celebrating a business deal with friends. He was in high spirits, posting a photo to social media showing him drinking with his production assistant and friend, Zachary Hartwell, a 30-year-old Iraq War veteran. The mood was celebratory. When they left the bar around 2:30 a.m., Ryan slid behind the wheel of his pride and joy, a 2007 Porsche 911 GT3. This wasn't just a luxury car, it was a track-ready weapon. The GT3 is stripped down, raw, and incredibly fast, designed for drivers who respect the laws of physics. It is a machine that demands total focus. But that night, focus was absent. As the sleek white sports car pulled onto the dark, winding roads of Chester County, the silence of the suburbs was shattered by the roar of a flat-six engine being pushed to its absolute limit. Ryan Dunn, the man who had survived 1,000 intentional wrecks for the camera, was now hurtling down a public road at speeds that belonged on a NASCAR track, unaware that the script had run out and there were no safety crews waiting around the next bend. The police reconstruction of the accident paints a picture of terrifying velocity. On a stretch of Route 322, where the speed limit was a modest 55 miles per hour, Ryan's Porsche was estimated to be traveling at nearly 130 miles per hour. At that speed, a vehicle covers the length of a football field in roughly 1.5 seconds. The world outside the windows would have been a blur of black trees and streaking streetlights. Tunnel vision would have set in. At 130 miles per hour, the car isn't just driving, it is essentially a low-flying projectile. The tires are barely maintaining their relationship with the asphalt. Just past the Pottstown Pike exit, the road curves. It is a manageable turn at normal speeds, but at triple-digit velocity, it is a death trap. The Porsche lost traction. It didn't just slide, it launched. The car left the roadway, careening over a guardrail designed to stop vehicles moving at a fraction of that speed. It flew into the dense woods lining the highway. The first impact was with a tree, but the momentum was so violent that the car shattered. It was less of a collision and more of a disintegration. The vehicle was torn into pieces, the debris field scattering over a vast area. Almost immediately upon coming to rest, the wreckage erupted. The fuel lines, severed in the catastrophic impact, ignited. A massive fireball consumed what was left of the Porsche 911 GT3. In the dark woods of Pennsylvania, the Inferno burned hot and bright, a beacon of tragedy that drew the attention of passing drivers who called 911, reporting a fire that looked like a bomb had gone off. There was no chance for rescue. The sheer kinetic energy of the crash, combined with the immediate intensity of the fire, meant that the outcome was decided the moment the tires left the pavement. The invincibility that Ryan Dunn had projected for a decade had been an illusion all along. When the first responders arrived, they found a scene of utter devastation. The car was so badly mangled and charred that it was barely recognizable as a vehicle. Police reports later described it as looking like a crumpled ball of aluminum foil. Identification of the bodies was impossible at the scene due to the severity of the burns. It was only through the distinct tattoos that friends and the coroner could confirm that the driver was indeed the beloved Jackass star. The autopsy revealed the brutal truth. Ryan Dunn and Zachary Hartwell had died instantly from blunt force trauma and thermal injuries. They never felt the fire. The impact had taken them before the flames even touched them. The news broke the hearts of a generation. His best friend, Bam Margera, was filmed weeping at the crash site, a raw and visceral display of grief that stood in stark contrast to the carefree anarchy of their TV show. It was a sobering reminder that while Hollywood can edit out the danger, reality keeps the footage rolling. Ryan Dunn lived fast, and he died fast, leaving a void in the world of entertainment that has never quite been filled. His death served as a harsh wake-up call about the intoxicating but deadly mixture of speed and confidence. We leave the high-speed tragedies of the modern era and the tangled wreckage of Porsches to travel back in time to the golden age of Hollywood. We go to 1940, to a dusty road in Arizona. Our next subject was the original American action hero, the king of cowboys, who defined the Western genre before sound even came to movies. He didn't die in a race or a drunken stupor. He was driving a classic Cord 812, a masterpiece of Art Deco design, when he met his end in one of the most bizarre and singular accidents in history. It wasn't the crash that killed him, but a heavy metal suitcase sitting loosely in the back seat that turned into a deadly missile the moment he touched the brakes.
Number 6. Tom Mix. Long before the likes of John Wayne or Clint Eastwood squinted into the camera, there was Tom Mix. In 1940, he was not just an actor, he was an institution, the king of cowboys, a man who had practically invented the Western genre. With his oversized white Stetson hat, hand-tooled boots, and flamboyant personality, he was the first true megastar of the silent film era. He had made nearly 300 films, performed his own stunts, and lived a life as colorful as the Technicolor movies that would eventually replace him. But on October 12, 1940, the cameras weren't rolling, and the setting wasn't a studio backlot. It was the dusty, open expanse of Arizona, a landscape he had romanticized to millions, now waiting to claim him. Tom was 60 years old, a twilight figure in a changing Hollywood, but he still lived with the flair of a showman. He was behind the wheel of a 1937 Cord 812 supercharged Phaeton. This was not a rugged horse. It was a masterpiece of Art Deco engineering, painted a bright, screaming yellow. It was low, sleek, and fast, a car that announced the arrival of a celebrity long before the engine shut off. He was driving north from Tucson to Phoenix, reportedly carrying a large amount of cash and traveler's checks, flashing his wealth just as he did his smile. The day was clear, the desert sun beating down on the convertible top, which was down to let the wind rush through. Tom was known for driving fast. He treated his car like he treated his stallions, with a firm hand and a demand for performance. He was reportedly doing 80 miles per hour on a gravel road, a speed that was bordering on reckless for the conditions of 1940. But Tom Mix had survived gunfights, stampedes, and explosions. He felt invincible in his yellow chariot, roaring through the Pinal County desert, unaware that a mundane piece of luggage sitting unsecured in the back seat was about to become the most dangerous object in his life. As the afternoon wore on, the road ahead presented a sudden and deadly surprise. Highway 89 was under repair. There were no flashing LED signs or well-lit warnings back then, just crude barriers on the raw earth. As Tom crested a slight rise near Florence, Arizona, he was suddenly confronted with a construction barricade spanning a washed-out bridge. A detour sign pointed to a rough path through a dry gully, but at 80 miles per hour, reaction times are measured in fractions of a heartbeat. Tom reacted with the instincts of a stuntman. He slammed on the brakes and swerved to avoid the barrier. The heavy Cord 812 skidded violently. It careened off the road and plunged into the wash. The car didn't smash into a wall or another vehicle. It gyrated wildly, tipping over and eventually coming to a halt in the dry riverbed. To an observer, the crash itself might have looked survivable. The The car was damaged, yes, but the passenger compartment wasn't obliterated like James Dean's Porsche. Tom was wearing a seatbelt, rare for the time, and his body was largely uninjured by the impact of the car hitting the ground. But physics is a cruel mistress with a dark sense of humor. In the back seat of the convertible sat a large, heavy aluminum suitcase. It was packed tight with his effects, effectively a solid block of metal. When the car stopped abruptly in the gully, the suitcase did not. Following Newton's first law of motion, it continued traveling forward at 80 miles per hour. It became a missile launched from the rear of the vehicle, targeting the driver's seat with terrifying precision. The impact was swift and silent. The suitcase struck Tom Mix squarely in the back of the head. The force was tremendous, shattering his cervical spine instantly. The king of cowboys didn't suffer. He didn't gasp for air or feel the pain of the wreck. His neck snapped, and he was dead before the dust cloud from the skid had even settled over the Arizona desert. It was a freakish, singular death, killed not by the crash itself, but by his own luggage. When authorities arrived, they found the legendary star sitting seemingly untouched in the driver's seat. There was no blood, no gruesome disfigurement. He looked as if he were simply resting, his famous white hat nearby, the yellow car glistening in the sun. The suitcase, the silent assassin, lay wedged against him. It was a tragic, almost cinematic end to a man who had lived his life in the spotlight, proving that even the toughest heroes are vulnerable to the simplest laws of momentum. From the dry, sun-baked desert of Arizona, we travel forward in time and across the country to the slick, rain-soaked streets of Los Angeles. We leave the world of westerns for the world of comedy. Our next victim was a television pioneer, a genius of the absurd who made millions laugh with his visual gags. But on a dark, stormy night in 1962, the laughter stopped abruptly. He lost control of his Chevrolet Corvair on a wet curve, sliding sideways into a telephone pole that struck the driver's door with such pinpoint accuracy it left the world of comedy mourning one of its brightest lights, instantly. Number 7. Ernie Kovacs. From the dry, sun-baked gullies of the Arizona desert, we travel forward 2 decades to a place where rain is a rarity, but when it falls, it turns the streets into treacherous rivers of oil and asphalt. The date was January 13, 1962. The setting was the glittering wet pavement of Beverly Hills, Los Angeles. The man at the center of this tragedy was not a cowboy, but a visionary who had reshaped the very landscape of American television. Ernie Kovacs was a genius of the absurd, a comedian whose surreal visual gags and refusal to adhere to the rules of the medium made him a legend. He was the man who stared into the camera and winked, knowing that life was just one big, elaborate joke. With his trademark oversized cigar and mustache, he was a figure of sophisticated chaos, a man who seemed to be in on a secret that the rest of us were just trying to figure out. On this particular night, the mood in Hollywood was celebratory. Ernie had been attending a baby shower for the wife of Milton Berle, hosted by the director Billy Wilder. It was a gathering of the elite, a room full of laughter, smoke, and champagne. Ernie was in high spirits. He was at the top of his game, loved by his peers and adored by the public. As the party wound down in the early hours of the morning, the skies over Los Angeles opened up. A heavy, relentless rain began to fall, the kind that natives of Southern California know to fear. It wasn't just water, it was a slick lubricant washing months of accumulated oil and rubber dust up from the pores of the road. Ernie said his goodbyes, flashing that familiar grin, and walked out into the downpour. He approached his car, a white Chevrolet Corvair station wagon. In the annals of automotive history, few names carry as much weight and controversy as the Corvair. It was a car that would later become the primary target of Ralph Nader's blistering exposé, Unsafe at Any Speed. Known for its rear engine layout and a suspension system that could be unpredictable in the hands of the unsuspecting, the Corvair was a machine that demanded respect. On a dry day, it was quirky. On a wet, slick night in Beverly Hills with worn tires and a slightly heavy foot, it was a loaded weapon.
Ernie climbed in, fired up the engine, and lit one last cigar, unaware that the final punchline was waiting just a few miles down Santa Monica Boulevard. The drive was short, a route he likely knew by heart. He was heading home to his wife, the singer and actress Edie Adams. The streets were largely empty, glistening under the streetlights like black obsidian. Ernie turned onto Santa Monica Boulevard, a wide, sweeping road that cuts through the heart of the city. He wasn't speeding in the traditional sense. Witnesses and reports suggest he was moving at a moderate pace, perhaps slightly faster than the conditions allowed, but certainly not racing. However, the physics of a rear-engine car on a wet surface are unforgiving. As he navigated a gentle curve near the intersection with Beverly Glen, the laws of friction abandoned him. It happened in a heartbeat. The Corvair's rear tires lost their grip on the oily sheen coating the asphalt. The heavy back end of the car, where the engine sat like a pendulum, swung out violently. This is the dreaded oversteer, a phenomenon where the car tries to swap ends. Ernie likely tried to correct it, turning the wheel into the skid, but the slide was too sudden, too aggressive. The station wagon didn't spin out into a safe stop. It slid sideways, hopping the curb with a sickening thud. It was no longer a car being driven. It was a 2-ton sled sliding uncontrollably across the wet grass. Directly in its path stood a utility pole. It was a standard wooden telephone pole, an object you pass 1,000 times without noticing. But in a side-impact collision, a pole is the deadliest object on the road. Unlike a wall that spreads the force of the impact, a pole concentrates all the energy of the crash into a narrow, vertical line. The Corvair slammed into the pole broadside, directly on the driver's door. There were no side airbags in 1962. There were no reinforced crumple zones. There was just a thin sheet of metal and glass separating Ernie Kovacs from the unyielding wood. The pole cut into the vehicle like a knife, striking exactly where the driver was sitting. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the rain hissing on the hot engine. When the first responders arrived, they found a scene that was as tragic as it was surreal. The car was wrapped around the pole, almost embracing it. Inside, Ernie Kovacs lay dead. The impact had been instantaneous and catastrophic. The pole had struck his head, fracturing his skull and killing him before his brain could even register the crash. There was no suffering, no prolonged agony, just a sudden, violent lights out. In a detail that feels like it was written for a movie, his unlit cigar was found lying on the pavement just inches from his outstretched hand, having fallen from his fingers at the moment of impact. The news shattered the comedy world. Jack Lemmon, his best friend, had to identify the body, a task that haunted him for the rest of his life. Edie Adams was left a widow, facing not only the loss of her soulmate, but a mountain of gambling debts he had left behind, debts she would spend years paying off, honoring his memory with a stoic grace. The crash became a cautionary tale about the Corvair, fueling the fire of safety regulations that would eventually transform the auto industry. Ernie Kovacs, the man who made the world laugh at the absurdity of life, had fallen victim to the absurdity of death. A little bit of rain, a little bit of oil, and a single wooden pole. From the silent, instant death of a comedy legend in the rain, we move to a different kind of tragedy, one that was loud, chaotic, and hauntingly vocal. We travel 30 years forward to the desert highways near the California-Nevada border. Our next victim was another comedian, but one whose style was a scream of primal rage. He was the wildest voice of the 1980s, a former preacher turned rock and roll comic. He didn't die instantly. When his car was struck head-on by a drunk driver, he survived long enough to have a final, chilling conversation with an invisible presence, pleading with the heavens in a dialogue that witnesses will never forget. Number 8. Sam Kinison. On April 10, 1992, the desolate stretch of U.S. Route 95 near Needles, California, was baking under the relentless desert sun. It is a landscape of harsh beauty, where the heat rises in shimmering waves off the asphalt and the horizon seems to stretch on forever. Driving through this arid wasteland was a man whose voice had defined the aggression and excess of the 1980s, Sam Kinison. He was a force of nature, a former Pentecostal preacher who had taken the fire and brimstone of the pulpit and channeled it into the comedy clubs of America. He was the scream comedian, a man who roared his punchlines with a primal rage that shook audiences to their core. He was loud, he was controversial, and he was undeniably brilliant. But on this particular Friday, the rage was gone. Sam was 38 years old, and for the first time in his chaotic life, he was genuinely happy. Just 6 days earlier, he had married Malika Suwiri, a dancer he had been with for years. They were in the honeymoon phase, glowing with the promise of a new chapter. Sam had reportedly cleaned up his act, moving away from the heavy drug use that had fueled his earlier career. He was slimming down, looking sharper, and feeling a sense of peace that had eluded him for decades. He was behind the wheel of his beloved 1989 Pontiac Trans Am GTA, a white muscle car that suited his rock and roll persona perfectly. Malika was in the passenger seat, and they were heading to a sold-out show at the Riverside Resort Hotel and Casino in Laughlin, Nevada. Following them in a van were Sam's brother, Bill, and his entourage. It was a caravan of celebration, a group of friends and family cruising through the desert, anticipating a night of laughter and applause. The mood was light. The radio was likely playing. The road ahead looked clear. But about 15 miles northwest of Needles, the illusion of safety was shattered. Approaching them from the opposite direction was a pickup truck driven by a 17-year-old. The boy had been drinking. In the cab of that truck sat the very demon that Sam had fought so hard to exorcise from his own life: intoxication. The pickup swerved. It didn't just drift, it crossed the double yellow line with a terrifying finality, moving directly into the path of the white Trans Am.
The impact was a thunderclap of violence that echoed across the canyon. It was a head-on collision, the most lethal type of crash two vehicles can experience. The closing speed, the combined velocity of the Trans Am and the pickup meant that there was no time to brake, no time to swerve, no time to pray. The front ends of both vehicles crumpled like accordions, glass shattered into a million diamonds, scattering across the sun-baked highway. The Trans Am was stopped dead in its tracks, the energy of the crash sent shuddering through the chassis and into the bodies of the passengers. Malika was knocked unconscious, but she would survive. Sam, however, took the brunt of the collision. The scene that followed is one of the most haunting in Hollywood history, documented by his brother Bill, who ran to the wreckage moments after the dust settled. Sam was not killed instantly. He was conscious. He had not been wearing a seatbelt and he had hit the windshield, but he managed to pull himself back. He looked at his brother. According to Bill, Sam looked remarkably intact for a moment, leading them to hope for a miracle. But inside, his body was failing. The internal trauma was catastrophic. It was then that the screaming comedian, the man who had made a career out of noise, began to speak in a soft, conversational tone to someone no one else could see. "I don't want to die. I don't want to die," Sam said, his voice laced with confusion and fear. He was looking past his brother, staring into the empty desert air as if engaged in a dialogue with an invisible presence. Then his demeanor changed. The panic vanished. He stopped fighting. He seemed to be listening to a voice that only he could hear. He nodded, as if accepting an order or a reassurance. "Okay," he said softly. "Okay. Okay." It was a moment of profound, chilling acceptance. The fire went out of his eyes. The tension left his body. He leaned back against the seat, closed his eyes, and the loudest voice in comedy fell silent forever. Attempts to revive him were futile. Sam Kinison died right there on the side of the road, amidst the heat and the wreckage, held by his brother. The autopsy later confirmed that he had suffered a torn aorta, an injury that is almost always fatal within minutes. The teenager in the pickup truck survived and was later charged with vehicular manslaughter, a cruel twist of fate that saw a man who had survived his own demons be killed by the reckless choices of a stranger.
Sam was buried in Tulsa, Oklahoma, his grave marked with the inscription, "In another time and place he would have been called a prophet." The story of Sam Kinnison's death is more than just a car crash. It is a spiritual mystery. Who was he talking to? Was it God? Was it a hallucination caused by hypoxia? Or was it the final peaceful realization that the show was over? We will never know. But the image of the man who screamed at the world, finally whispering "okay" to death, remains one of the most poignant exits in fame. His death marked the end of an era of comedy, silencing a voice that was as necessary as it was abrasive. From the dusty, heat-scorched highway of the American desert, we travel across the ocean to the glittering, sun-dappled coast of the French Riviera. We leave the world of rock and roll comedy for the world of royalty. Our next subject was a woman who lived a life that millions of little girls dream of. She traded an Academy Award for a crown, leaving Hollywood to become a real-life princess. But fairy tales rarely have tragic endings, and hers ended not in a castle, but on a winding, treacherous mountain road, the very same road she had driven in her most famous film, where a sudden medical emergency turned a leisurely drive into a plunge that shook the world. Number 9. Grace Kelly. The transition from the scorched asphalt of the Mojave Desert to the winding, pine-scented corniches of the French Riviera is a shift from purgatory to paradise. It is here, overlooking the azure waters of the Mediterranean, that the fairy tale of the 20th century played out. Grace Kelly had done what few dared to dream. She walked away from Hollywood at the peak of her powers, leaving behind an Oscar and a legacy of icy blonde perfection to marry Prince Rainier III of Monaco. She became Her Serene Highness, a title that seemed to fit her better than any costume ever had. On September 13, 1982, the sun was shining on the Principality, casting that famous golden glow over the yachts in the harbor. It was a Monday, the beginning of a week that promised the usual routine of royal duties and family life. Princess Grace, now 52, was at their country home, Rock Angel. She decided to drive back to the palace in Monaco herself. This was a rarity. Usually, a chauffeur would be behind the wheel, but on this day, the back seat was filled with dresses and boxes, leaving no room for a driver. She took the keys to her 11-year-old Rover 3500, a sensible, sturdy British saloon car. Sitting beside her was her youngest daughter, Princess Stephanie, then just 17. The two of them set off down the Route de la Turbie, a narrow, treacherous road that snakes down the steep mountainside. There is a haunting cinematic echo in this drive. Decades earlier, in the Hitchcock masterpiece To Catch a Thief, Grace had driven these very same winding roads with Cary Grant, driving fast and fearlessly in a scene that became iconic. But life is not a movie, and on this September morning, there were no cameras, no stunt coordinators, and no second takes. As they navigated a particularly sharp hairpin turn known as the Devil's Curse, something went terribly wrong inside the cabin of the Rover. It wasn't a mechanical failure or a patch of oil. It was a biological catastrophe. Grace suddenly complained of a severe headache. Moments later, she slumped over. A minor stroke had struck, seizing her brain and her body in the worst possible place on Earth to lose control. Princess Stephanie, terrified and helpless in the passenger seat, watched as her mother lost consciousness. The car, now a guided missile without a pilot, did not slow down for the hairpin turn. Instead, it accelerated. Witnesses reported seeing the Rover erratically swerving before it failed to negotiate the sharp bend. It didn't just drift off the road, it launched into the void. The car smashed through the low retaining wall that separated the road from the sheer drop. The Rover 3500 plummeted 120 feet down the rocky wooded slope. It was a violent tumbling descent. The car crashed through trees and brush, rolling over multiple times, a chaotic metal cage disintegrating with every impact. The sound of tearing steel and breaking glass shattered the tranquility of the hillside. Finally, the vehicle came to rest in a garden far below, a crumpled heap of wreckage that looked nothing like the royal carriage it had been just seconds before. Rescuers rushed to the scene, expecting the worst. They found Princess Stephanie alive, suffering from a concussion and a fractured vertebra, but conscious. Grace, however, was in critical condition. She was pulled from the wreckage, unconscious and battered, and rushed to the Princess Grace Hospital, the very institution named in her honor. The news flashed around the globe. The princess had crashed. For 24 agonizing hours, the world held its breath. People prayed outside the palace gates. But the medical reality was grim. The initial stroke had caused the crash, but the impact had caused massive, irreversible brain trauma. She was in a deep coma, her life sustained only by machines, while her husband and children faced the impossible choice that no amount of wealth or royalty can protect you from.
On the evening of September 14, the decision was made. Prince Rainier, devastated and heartbroken, gave the order to remove life support. Princess Grace of Monaco, the girl from Philadelphia who had captivated the world, slipped away peacefully. Her death marked the end of an era of elegance. It was a tragedy that felt deeply personal to millions, a reminder that even in the most charmed lives, fate is weighing around the next bend. The hairpin turn where she fell remains a somber landmark, a place where the line between cinema legend and tragic reality blurred forever. We leave the heights of royalty and the cliffs of Monaco for one final journey. We return to England, to a man who didn't play a king, but a wizard of technology. He was the man who equipped the world's greatest spy with the gadgets to survive anything, from ejector seats to laser watches. For decades, he was the calm, exasperated voice of reason in the chaotic world of James Bond, the man known simply as Q. But in 1999, on a country road in East Sussex, there were no gadgets to save him. He was driving home from a book signing, a simple drive on a Sunday afternoon, when a head-on collision claimed the life of the man who had spent his career explaining how to cheat death. Number 10. Desmond Llewellyn. The date was December 19, 1999. The world was on the cusp of a new millennium, anxiously counting down the days to Y2K. In the quiet, rolling countryside of East Sussex, England, a man was driving home, looking forward to a peaceful Christmas. His face was one of the most recognizable in the history of cinema, yet few people knew his real name. To the world, he was simply Q. Desmond Llewellyn had played the beleaguered, brilliant quartermaster of MI6 in 17 James Bond films spanning nearly 4 decades. He had briefed Sean Connery, George Lazenby, Roger Moore, Timothy Dalton, and Pierce Brosnan, equipping them with the explosive pens, ejector seats, and laser watches that allowed 007 to cheat death time and time again. Desmond was 85 years old, a towering figure of British dignity and warmth. Despite his on-screen persona as a gadget wizard, in real life he famously struggled to program a VCR. He was an actor, a storyteller, and a beloved grandfather figure to generations of moviegoers. That Sunday, he had been at a book signing event in the town of Polegate promoting his biography. He spent hours signing autographs, smiling and chatting with fans who had grown up watching him scold Bond for destroying his equipment. He was in high spirits, driving his personal car, a blue Renault Megane. It wasn't an Aston Martin loaded with rockets. It was a sensible, modest hatchback, a car for a man who had nothing left to prove. He was traveling westbound on the A27, a road that winds through the South Downs. It is a scenic route flanked by green fields and ancient hills, but it is also a road known for its deception. It twists and turns with hidden dips and crests that can hide oncoming traffic from even the most careful drivers. The winter sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows and creating patches of glare on the damp tarmac. Desmond was alone in the car, likely thinking about the holidays, unaware that he was driving toward a blind crest near the village of Firle that would mark the final scene of a life well lived. Around 1 p.m., the tragedy unfolded with the brutal simplicity of a physics equation. As Desmond's Renault crested a rise in the road, he found himself on a collision course. Driving in the opposite direction was a Fiat Bravo, driven by a 35-year-old man. The details of exactly how the cars met have been debated, whether it was a botched overtake or a momentary lapse in lane discipline due to the blinding sun, but the result was indisputable. The two cars collided head-on. The impact was tremendous. The closing speed on the A27, where the national speed limit applies, meant that the energy released in the crash was devastating. The front ends of the Renault and the Fiat were obliterated, crumpling inwards to absorb the force. The sound of the collision, twisting metal, shattering glass, and the sickening thud of impact rang out across the quiet fields. Other motorists slammed on their brakes, rushing to the smoking wrecks to offer aid. When they reached Desmond, the situation was confusing. He was conscious. The adrenaline of the crash was surging through his 85-year-old frame, masking the true extent of the damage. He was trapped in the driver's seat, the dashboard crushed against him. Witnesses reported that he was talking, perhaps a testament to the stiff upper lip of a generation that had lived through the Blitz. He seemed, miraculously, to be okay. But the human body is not made of the same resilient fiction as the characters he supported on screen. Beneath the surface, catastrophic internal injuries were already taking hold. His ribs were fractured, and the trauma to his internal organs was severe. As fire crews worked desperately with hydraulic cutting equipment to free him from the twisted metal of the Renault, the clock was ticking down on a battle that no gadget could win. Desmond was carefully extracted from the wreckage and transferred to a waiting police helicopter. He was airlifted to the Eastbourne District General Hospital, the flight crew fighting to keep his vitals stable. For a brief window, there was hope. He had survived the crash site. He was in the hands of the best trauma teams available. But the shock to his system was too great. The internal bleeding was relentless. Shortly after arriving at the hospital, his condition deteriorated rapidly. Despite the frantic efforts of the surgeons, Desmond Llewellyn passed away that afternoon. The irony was heartbreaking. Just weeks earlier, his final Bond film, The World Is Not Enough, had premiered. In that film, Q descends into the floor of the laboratory, delivering a poignant line to Bond: "Always have an escape plan." It felt like a farewell, a scripted retirement for the character. No one could have predicted that the actor himself would make his final exit so soon after, on a cold stretch of British asphalt. His death was not due to a villain's plot or a high-stakes chase, but the mundane, brutal reality of a car accident. These 10 stories serve as a grim reminder that the screen protects no one. From the rebellious speed of James Dean to the quiet dignity of Desmond Llewellyn, the road is the great equalizer. It does not care about box office returns, Oscars, or fame. It demands respect, attention, and a recognition of our own fragility. These legends, who seemed larger than life, were ultimately just passengers in a world governed by physics. As you head out onto the road today, remember their stories. Check your mirrors, watch your speed, and never take the journey for granted. This is the end of our series. Drive safe, and thank you for listening.